Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. Problem solvers have problems too. So here at Behind the Podium, I, Jared Cohen, and my co-host Alexander Ellis discuss the struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of the coach, or said more broadly, health and wellness practitioner. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. So without further ado, join us as we dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind. Welcome to another episode of Behind the Podium, looking at the evolving practices, struggles, and philosophies of the coach, the healthcare practitioner, the teacher, and/or anyone looking to provide service to another human being, and really the conversation that should be universal to everyone, as we've all had experiences being coached, being taught something, and those have personally relevant details that define who we are. And so we continue that conversation today with myself, Jared Cohen, and
Alexander Ellis.
And we are here with the topic on hand being the languaging of clarity versus accuracy, and how we as coaches and teachers try to best express what we want to express while also not losing our clients within some of the ambiguity that only comes from being in the field and studying it as the coach or teacher would have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how to say what you mean, but still mean what you say, and then squeeze some education in there. And I know for myself, the languaging that you and I both coach with now, where we're throwing down anatomical terms and talking, it's flexion and extension instead of lift your arms and bring your arms back or whatever. And many times people struggle with that because they're like, well, that doesn't make sense to people because everybody else has been saying something different. And I just think of like a yoga class, when you walk into your first yoga class and the teacher is saying, okay, now Tadasana and Uttanasana, and throwing out all of these Sanskrit terms that nobody even understands. And I think that we've also, even with that, it's just like, it's the same thing, whether it's Sanskrit, whether I'm speaking Greek, whether I'm speaking anatomy or biomechanics. If I don't have the backbone of, understanding underneath all of that, I could be speaking Chinese for all my students care,
Yeah. It's so complicated because of so many of the different expectations that people are walking in the room with, and the past experiences that have shaped their understanding about one thing or another.
Yeah.
Because I think about it too, where practically it doesn't make sense to just walk into a room and be overwhelmed with Sanskrit. Mm-hmm. However, somebody may be looking for that very culturally immersed experience when they go to their yoga class, where it exists in that element of just soak it up, that like there isn't so much of the formal teaching. I know a lot of Japanese, and for that matter, kind of Eastern martial arts, and probably most traditional martial arts function in that manner in which there isn't so much linear coaching or teaching. It's kind of like you're in the class and you just kind of take it as it comes. That
and you pick up what you can.
Pick up what you can, mm-hmm. Which in this day and age, right, is another aspect of it as we learn more and as research confirms some things about the learning process. We may be informed otherwise to say that it's not the best way to teach someone something. You're actually losing a lot. And then that becomes an issue too, is we're fighting the practices and traditions of of prior.
Well, and it also doesn't take into consideration how each person learns, you know?
Right.
Even if, let's say you're teaching a small class and you have 5 people, every single one of those people come to your class with different experiences, with different understandings, you know, different movement histories, whatever. And so what one cue means to one person will mean 5 different things to everybody else in the room. You know, you just don't know, which is why clarity is so important, which is why I love teaching with anatomical terms and, you know, directions of movement that are standard in biomechanics and research articles and all of that stuff, because you can't argue with that. Flexion is flexion is flexion is flexion. I will bring in other verbs that will help to improve that understanding and clarity. And I might even get extra fancy and tailor it to the people in the room. You know, back again to the 5 students. What if one student is like a plumber and one student is a lawyer, or, you know, whatever? You could use specific verbs for each of those jobs, and then it'll take on a whole new meaning and understanding for each student. So it can be super complex, your languaging, or it can be super simplistic. But it's like, the hardest thing, I think, is getting your point across to multiple people at the same time.
Right. And I think with that is this question of prerequisites. So I know, and you know, obviously, within Jill Miller, creator of Yoga Tune Up, author of The Role Model, her level 1 training, the day 1 is like, okay, let's go over these directions of movement. And let's look at these in their own ways, so that now you have this context of language that I'm going to use from here on out, right? But it requires like that prerequisite to be filled on from the student prior to being able to then speak with more of that universal clarity. And so I wonder, and this can be a direct question for you, when you teach classes, how are you always kind of starting with like, hey guys, review, this is flexion, this is extension, internal rotation, external rotation, just so that you can use those terms and then speak with more clarity? Or, you know, how does that work?
No, not at all, because that would run on the assumption that there's the same people in class every week, and that never is the case.
Right.
What you're referencing about the level 1 teacher training, you know, that's a journey that you know, container of a group will go on for 7 days. So starting day 1, this is how we're talking, this is what you need to understand, completely works. But in the real world, and I'm sure you experience this as well, there's different people in your classes all the time.
Right.
And sometimes, you know, what I find the most challenging is when you have, let's say, a majority of returning students and then like 2 or 3 new students. And I want to teach to the returning students and give them all that awesome information, but I can't leave the new people laying in the dust. So what I found to be useful is repetition and layering. Just as I would imagine any teacher of any modality would also use. So, and then also with movement, we have the added bonus of mirror neurons. So what I do and I show in the front of the room, you'll copy, because that's how we are as humans.
Right.
Which is why you, as a teacher, demonstrating impeccably is so important. So, you know, I think let's take shoulder external rotation, for example. So, you know, I'll say, you know, spin your arms away from one another, for example, and then I'll demonstrate it. And then the next time I come back to it, instead of repeating the same word, I'll either use a new verb or say, you know, externally rotate. Did you know this was external rotation? And after enough repetitions of that same movement again and again, not in that class specifically, but across, you know, months and months and months, that'll stick for people and they'll understand. And there's still people who I could say external rotation 50 million times in 1 hour and they still wouldn't remember next week, you know, just, but
so here's a thought then is,
yeah.
This is something I've caught myself with as like outside, even beyond just the coaching realm. I am always thinking about, okay, I want to get better at the clarity of my communication, being more articulate, coherent, less is more. And so with that, I need to avoid redundancy. Mm-hmm. However, it sounds like what you're saying is redundancy and maybe not, and this is a part of repetition, but redundancy is so important within the class to give them that learning experience without just point blank saying external rotation means. So for instance,
Right.
you can say, I want you to externally rotate your shoulder, make sure you're turning that hand away from your thigh, and you essentially were just redundant. However, it served a purpose.
Yeah.
That was, that repetition of what external rotation means.
Yeah, and if in a single class, I know that I need them to know what external rotation is, and that's a critical step, I'll take the time to break it down, just like we're just saying, this is what it is. That way, 45 minutes into class, when I'm like, okay, externally rotate as you do this, they already have that layered context. But that, again, that's just the container of the 60-minute or 75-minute, whatever it is, class. And that might not carry over to the next time. But hopefully it does. And I've actually seen that happen. What I was going to say is a few of my classes I've been teaching at the same time slot with the same students for over a year, some for 2 years. And you can say any direction of movement pretty much for them, and they get it.
Wow.
And they do it awesome. And so teaching them is easy because I can say external rotation and then come up with some creative language story. I don't have to, be fishing for things to make sure that everything's landing with people. And then I also teach a class where every single week, for some reason, it's new people. Always new people. And so every time is an educational opportunity, but at different levels. It's like kindergarten every single week. Kindergarten for your body.
Have you found that this comes up with me a lot, is I'm using the term external rotation and demoing it as such. However, I find so many clients, they internally interpret that as internal rotation. Not that they're internally rotating, but that, like, to them it makes more sense because they see it as like, oh, my elbow is coming in, right? And this is, one of the things we were thinking about in titling this episode, educating while retaining clarity versus the accuracy component. Because sometimes, like, when someone's like, you mean like rotate it in, and they're showing me external rotation, then I'll be like, yeah, sure. If that helps you think about it like that, then fine. Yes, that's what you're doing. Because what's more important is that outcome. I want their shoulder to be in that position. In the moment, I don't need them to get that right on a test. What is external rotation?
Right.
And then, but that becomes its own sort of black box, because I also don't want them going into the real world and maybe thinking about external rotation incorrectly, because that could have its own ramifications, especially when my goal is always trying to thread many concepts and create more dot connecting. Yeah.
Well, even with anatomical terms, I'm thinking directions of movement specifically, there's a difference in academic languaging versus clinical languaging. So for the shoulder, for example, usually in clinical languaging, they always reference the shoulder joint. And in academic, they'll reference the limb. So it'll be, I think it's the upper arm and then the arm. So, they'll say flex the upper arm or something like that. And then flex the arm would be flexion at the elbow. So there's even more confusion and grayness in that way as well. So sometimes, if you have a skeleton out, that's always useful, but that's not practical.
Right.
Embodiment is super helpful. Like, okay, touch your shoulder, and do you feel how it's spinning this way? And, getting them to touch the bones, or describing it from the joint itself. And sometimes they're not going to get it, and maybe that's a person who is interested in anatomy and might, come for further education down the line. But I guess my point is that describing it from the joint and figuring out how to get them to better embody it would be ideal. But in a situation where, hey, the clock is running and I need this person to do X, Y, Z, the pressure's a little bit higher. Yeah, I'm just going to go with what they say because they're doing it right and we have to move on.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating. So take this a little further. Here's a quote saying with our quote frequency per episode. This comes from Doug Larson, one of the owners of Faction Strength and Conditioning in Memphis, Tennessee, I believe, and obviously one of the founders and hosts of the Barbell Shrug podcast. This was an episode that they did with Tim Ferriss, and part of the conversation was much about what we're talking about now, language and the implications that it has. And the quote that I wrote down from Doug Larson was that oftentimes a coach can unknowingly be framing an experience and what it should be for a client by naming it inappropriately.
Totally.
And there we're talking not even so much about the language content, but the context, i.e., what are you calling something? What is the title of this movement? So, for instance, I've always been thinking a lot about renaming certain things that we've, again, just taken for granted, much like in the yoga space, we'll use the Sanskrit because that's always been there. So in the strength and conditioning space, we have this movement called the good morning.
Right.
Why is it called a good morning? And
I have no idea.
And maybe there is some good reason to that, but it's not good enough to justify the fact that we continue using it when really we should just say, you're hip hinging. And so now we're saying what we mean. And,
right.
And then there is a moment where every time we do that movement and we name it, there is this universal understanding of the hip hinging versus just the one-dimensional aspect of the mirror neurons seeing something but not really understanding what they're seeing because they didn't have a name that accompanied that visual appropriately.
Yeah, and the naming, I think, is also like community specific, and doesn't, like, again, that idea of, okay, so I have 5 people in front of me. They all come from different backgrounds, and what good morning means to one person might not be the same to the other person because maybe they had a coach who taught it differently.
Yeah.
So really breaking it down to the nitty gritty, to the like, you can't argue with the directions of movement in the clinical anatomy space because, like, that's what it is. That's what doctors and surgeons and physical therapists and chiropractors worldwide have agreed to call things. Well, not agreed. I mean, it's just like, it is. It is what it is. Just like email is email everywhere,
Yeah, right.
But also this idea of, like, each student coming with their own history and their own background and making sure that what you're choosing to call things doesn't skew their perception of it. I had an interesting experience with a student who I didn't know had PTSD. And so, when we're rolling on the therapy balls, it can be very uncomfortable and people make faces, crazy faces sometimes. And not even a cue, but like a story I had picked up from another teacher. So it wasn't even something that was authentic to me, but I was repeating it because I heard it from my teacher. So I thought, oh, this will be useful, whatever. Anyways, it's like, keep your face relaxed. Make sure it's not scrunched up like you just saw a murder. And, you get a few laughs and you move on and you don't think anything of it. I mean, I honestly have said that so many times with no problem. And I'm so grateful that the student asked if, after class, can I give you some feedback? And I was like, yes, please. And the student had PTSD, and that one little sentence about, like, don't scrunch your face up like you saw a murder brought up all of these uncomfortable feelings for them with just my language.
Yeah.
And you don't know, I mean, that's not to say, like, oh, you have to be super PC 24/7, but just know, I mean, even languaging that is, indicating fast movement versus slow movement. Well, do you want them to move fast or do you want them to move slow? And you can modulate that with your pitch, with how fast you speak, with the verbs you use, but always knowing that one cue is not enough. And even if it's okay for a while, you might have to throw it out. Like I threw that one out, the scrunch your face up. I don't use that one anymore. Yeah. I've got new stuff now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it highlights one of the overarching concepts of this podcast being, hey, we want to address the struggles of the coach. And that's a great example of like, hey, we're trying to deliver this material as best we can. We're looking to help people. And it's a big struggle sometimes when there are these nuances of, I want to get a point across, I want to create a fun environment, but what's fun to one person is not necessarily fun to another. And yes, there's always going to be that easy shrug off answer of like, oh, you can't please everyone, but
right.
We're really, we're in this for the best intentions and we want to help the most people. And those little things of presentational skills and qualities and adaptations are key to that. And then the other thing I think that you mentioned is the cue relevancy, the context this is something Kelly Starrett has talked about a bunch. Chest up, right? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
If we and that's where I think neutral spine is a really important prerequisite in then understanding where these other pieces then layer in. And I experienced this again with a fundamental I was working with last week. Again, them coming to my coachings with a bunch of different trainers in the past who just blanketly told them chest up. And to give them this understanding of it depends based on like, look, if you are rounded in your upper back, then yes, chest up is serving a purpose.
Right.
But if you're already where I need you to be, chest up is taking you out of that organized position. Mm-hmm. And now I like as a coach, I need you to wrestle with that and the dynamic nature of that, because that is where the money is beyond you just being able to remember every time chest up. You have to understand what it means to get set up accordingly, and based on that experience, then you can use some of the self cues that you want and or better interpret my cues or someone else's.
Yeah, and as far as interpreting cues, sometimes I'll even when I'm teaching something, if I'm struggling with how to like explain it, and students are getting it, I'll ask them. I was like, how do you describe this? Or how would you describe this? And some of my best cues for clarity come from my students because they're the ones embodying it in the moment.
Agreed. I have on the rower, you'll see this all the time, is that when people, on the rowing machine particularly, when people are pulling the oar on the erg towards them, they get this massively flexed wrist.
Right.
And like, it's
a little claw.
Yeah, right. And the best cue that I heard came from similar situation, a client when I was teaching them about how to look for that neutral and therefore more extended wrist from that overly flexed position. And they cued turning on the motorcycle, like revving the handle to
Interesting.
Get that.
Because for me, I've never been on a motorcycle, so I'm like, you do it with the handle? What?
I haven't really either, but I like kind of know the sort of concept from the arcades.
Vroom, vroom. Okay.
Like
Yeah.
The vroom vroom, and I know it from like the onomatopoeia sound.
Right. I love sound effects. They're not effective, really, I would say, as, clear language. But I find, if you're following your repeat words, mine are noises like, pew!
Yes. I had a coach that his was bang a lot. But bang!
It's like Emerald when he was cooking it, like, bam!
Yeah.
Like throw stuff in the pan.
It's those, and maybe our sounds actually do communicate more accuracy and clarity than the jargon that gets a little too heady.
Mm-hmm. And I think you also have to be I can't think of the precise word, but you can't be married to a certain cue or a certain description and convince yourself that it's the only one that works because everybody knows what you're talking about.
Definitely. Definitely.
Because everybody has a different story, and they, came to your class for different reasons with different understanding, and there's no such thing as the universal cue. Oh, I remember. I had a thought and I couldn't remember it, and I got it. Chest up made me think of good posture. And for so many of us, myself included, I always thought the good posture was, like chest up and shoulders back and down. And then I had like mid-trap pain all the time. I was like, why? I don't understand. And even last week, we were talking about posture, and the woman I was talking to was like, oh, you just mean chest up and shoulders back, right? I was like, no, not really. So for posture specifically, one that I like to use, which works when you're moving slow, but can also, if you can iron it in slowly, will carry over to faster movements, is to get the front of your rib cage directly on top of the front of your pelvis. So aligning xiphoid process over pubic symphysis. So there's a way to layer in anatomy. So they're like, oh, I didn't know that's what it was called. And your bony structure can function. I mean, it doesn't matter what the soft tissue shape is on top of it. So I have many different body sizes that come into my room, and rib cage over pelvis is the same, whether you have a larger gut area or you don't. And that has nothing to do with like chest up, shoulders down.
Yeah. Well, and to go back what I mentioned before earlier, let's say the client that said, oh, you mean chest up, shoulders back and down, was actually in a neutral position where you wanted them, would you still, that's a good example where it's like, you are doing the right thing, but I don't want you to think of it like this.
Right.
And this is one that I've seen evolve a little bit more with this term neutral spine. Cause I know when I first got into CrossFit, and it wasn't even in the early days like others, we're talking 2011, neutral spine was still not really being used yet. It was much more of that, we want to see the arch, right? The like, show me that natural lumbar curve,
right.
Which only caused people to emphasize it and therefore be overextended and have that chest up. And now I've seen the CrossFit community, I think a la more Kelly Starrett, adopt the neutral spine and provide that understanding. Yet still, I hear as a part of a lot of coaches' vernacular, this arch coming into play that I always have somewhat of like a cringe response to, because I think so many people, are already too overextended, and then you use that word, and now we're layering on something that is a little contradicting.
Right.
And that made me think of there's a client at the gym I work at who is really gung-ho about CrossFit and super enthusiastic, great guy, and he really wants to start coaching, and so he will come to other classes when he's not working to just observe if he's already taken that class today. And one of the pieces of advice that I gave him that I think is really good advice is, when you're watching other coaches, and particularly more listening, listen for the things that you think are incorrect or you think are not really getting the point across that they're trying to get across. Because we're all guilty of it in some way. And I know for me as a coach, that has really enhanced my game when I can be taking a step back and hear something that's being said and think to myself, is that really what he's trying to get after? So another one like chest up is shrug your shoulders,
right?
In the overhead squat. And we don't want shoulder shrugging. We don't want shoulder elevation, right? We're looking more for upward rotation of the scapula. And with that, if I'm just cueing external rotation and maybe more a reaching or upward pressure cue, that point can get across better than if I tell someone, just jam your shoulders into your ears, Well,
what do you mean? What are you trying to say?
Yeah. And so, but again, like how we all get in some ways married to certain cues, and that's 100%. That's a hard game to work ourselves out of, especially when we're also trying to continue our education. And a lot of the continuum of education comes in very dense highly technical terms. And now I'm always in this space where, like, in order to learn it better, right, I want to practice it. I want to have that repetition, but I can't necessarily practice it exactly as I'm learning it because that doesn't translate. And now I have to do that filtering process. And
I mean, I always try to keep it simple when I learn new stuff. So instead of the whole, like, oh, I would love to teach you the whole 9-hour course I learned this weekend, but I'm going to teach you one little piece. And then you have 9 weeks of programming because you just teach a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more.
Right.
And I think it's so cool what you said to the coach about, you know, listen for the things that you don't think are landing well, because that happened to me right after my first teacher training started. When you start to teach, when you go to classes, you already hear and experience it completely differently because you are kind of peeking behind the curtain and you can imagine yourself in that seat. And so I do that. So it's cool to hear that you do that too. But I'm not just listening for stuff that doesn't work, but also listening for stuff that does work.
Yeah, totally. That's important too. But but the point in emphasizing the other was that as somebody new, you know, sometimes you think everything works, that like the people that you're watching or observing from does, right? You wouldn't really, it's only when you kind of get there later in the game that you start becoming more critical. Mm-hmm. You know, I think back to like my first guitar teachers that I thought were like, they were rock stars and really like, they were okay, you know, but like I never, you know, I didn't really have a point of a live, proximal point of reference, you know, to watch from. And so it's easy to assume, you know, that I'm just going to take everything as is, you know, that rote memorization and the relaying without really the critical point of how is somebody understanding what's happening. And oftentimes, like we've said, there is this continuum that's confusing because I'm trying to teach one point in the beginning and yet I have other movements that I need to teach them or other points of the curriculum that may not completely align with that overarching context. But I don't want to get too much into that because that'll, you know, derail where I'm going from. And I still think that overarching piece of context that I started with is important enough to just have them assume at all times unless told otherwise.
Right. Well, it's like the layered approach and also dealing with the most critical thing in the moment. So that's where, you know, students keep coming back and you have that repetition with the same student. You know, I don't have to continue to repeat to you about keep a neutral spine, get your rib cage over your pelvis because you already get that. Then I can add the next layer and the next layer and the next layer to, you know, not just sweeten the sauce, but make it extra savory. Whereas before we just had, you know, a very bland base.
And yet, how do you do that when there may not be so much coaches consistency, right? Like people are getting coached by different coaches, you know, and therefore it becomes a little harder to develop that, you know, that ladder or that linear understanding. Because it blows me away sometimes, you know, how often we are having to have the same conversation with the same students.
Right.
And that's not to say that there isn't, like, that a lot of times we always have to cue the basics. And in some of the hardest places we find ourselves in, whether it's movement or life, are the times where those basics most easily fall apart. And so even the best of us need to be cued into that. But when we're talking about basics in basics, it shouldn't be, you know, that we're having to always remind, you know, like PVC pipe pass-throughs or shoulder dislocates. Right. Why am I watching you?
Are they called shoulder dislocates?
Yeah, that's actually like...
That's a terrible name, P.S.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's a great point.
That's our point.
That's our point, right. That is like what it's been referred to, I think, more long-term within the the gymnastics community.
And
I think it's only the CrossFit community that somehow along the way, was like, hey, we're using a PVC pipe called
PVC pass-through.
Pass-through. But why am I watching you do that? And your ribs are flaring up every time.
Right.
I can understand if under that 300-pound deadlift, you're potentially a little unaware of what's happening with your spine. More so than when you have that PVC pipe. And that's where that standard too comes in. As a coach, how much am I holding these clients to that standard to allow for better layering to come? Yeah.
Well, I think in the context of my class, whether, again, it's an hour, 15 minutes, whatever, we are creating a container, and I'll sometimes encourage them just, and say something like, I know you may do this differently, but today just do it this way. And preface it with that.
Right.
Then you're able to build upon it as you want. And then it empowers the client or the student to hopefully make the conscious decision, whether they, after class are like, hey, for the first time ever, my shoulder didn't hurt when I was overhead squatting, or I didn't have that same shoulder pain when I was doing downward facing dog. Maybe that coach was onto something. I'm going to keep that cue in my arsenal. I'm going to keep that new thing I learned for the next time. Because I don't think it's our responsibility to tell somebody like, this is right for you. You have to do this. This is the only way to do it. Because it's it's them. It's their body. You have the right to do what you want with your body.
Definitely. So how do you respond to that? That's different than anything I've ever been told.
Right. Well, I had this experience while teaching. Much of what I learn, I feel like I learn from what I think is making a mistake, and then you move forward. So I had a class where we were teaching, or I was teaching, it was like mega plank, which is basically a forearm plank with your forearms parallel and focusing on trying to protract or separate the shoulder blades to engage the serratus anterior to really highlight shoulder stability. And we were doing, going from that plank position and then walking the feet in to kind of get the sense of moving from plank to like a dolphin shape, which is like a down dog, but forearms on the ground kind of thing. And, I was just nailing in, external rotation, try to pry your hands apart so you can turn on your rotator cuff. And I had a student who was just like, well, what about the teachers who say to do it with your hands together? And just like was asking me to answer that question for them. Like, well, they do it this way. Isn't that wrong? And what I learned from it, because I don't think I was a little bit on my soapbox that day.
Yeah, sometimes that happens, right?
And I was riled up.
Yeah.
I was on my soapbox. I was so riled up. And I don't think I handled it the best way because it kind of caused, not a rift, but it made more trouble after the class. And so what I've learned from that is to turn it back onto the student and say to them, I'm teaching you from a place of biomechanics. And if your hands are together in that position, your shoulders are slightly internally rotated, and it's not the ideal position and arrangement for the shoulder for stability. That's not to say that you can never do anything in internal rotation, because we should be exploring all ranges at all times. It doesn't make it illegal, but I also think that you as a student, try it out. See what works. If you're tired of having the clicking shoulder and pain in the front of your shoulder, maybe you should stop doing things internally rotated. Oh, that's what I wish I had said. Okay. That's not what I had said.
That was really good, though. I like that.
Thank you. Yeah. I've learned from my mistakes. What I instead said, on my soapbox while I was ranting was just like, you should never do things internally rotated and blah, 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 blah. And it blew up in my face about 3 weeks later.
Yeah. I feel you. That's definitely that's part of the struggle, and I think that comes from the struggle of having so many clients, especially for the work that you and I do, that is more or pegged as more mobility specific. Then we have these clients that come up to us a lot of the time complaining about pains and aches, and that's where I, then end up taking the soapbox, is I'm frustrated on their behalf, you know, and especially when I know so many of these things can be prevented. And then I get into this corner where I feel like, in an emotional place, the only way I'm going to get this point across is if I, sort of underscore it with such emotional intensity of like, don't ever do that,
I know.
And this is something let's see, where is this here? This is,
well, I think all we can do is educate people and empower them to make conscious decisions of how they want to use their bodies. And it does them no good for me to tell you, like, you should do this and you shouldn't do that, because I'm not in your back pocket. I'm not with you all the time. So I can't be the judge of what's okay for your body. I'm not in your body. I'm not with you. It's your body. Take ownership.
Yeah, take ownership. And I think with that as well, and this is something for a future episode, is this prerequisite element. I know with Dr. Andre Ospina's functional range conditioning system, a lot of it is embedded within this prerequisite understanding of, within this mobility model, how do I make sure my joints and connective tissue have gone through the appropriate learning curve, so to speak, to then be able to handle the various movements, especially the movements that are deemed more anatomically or biomechanically incorrect. Because there's some different camps here where I think more in the Kelly Starrett camp is like, these are ideal shapes. Don't get into the other shapes most of the time. Whereas, Andre Ospina's camp is more like, well, if you're not training the shapes that are unideal in some capacity, then when you do get in them, because, life happens,
right.
And definitely those are two extremes. And I think they would both defend them, but just to kind of paint that dichotomy to get us as coaches thinking about how we then coach the gray area.
Right. But I think it also depends on the context. And actually, I have a story of you when I first met you. Wasn't it it was a hips immersion?
Yeah.
And we did a thing where the hands were interlaced and were internally rotated. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I remember.
I was just like, Jared, just let it go. But
that's
for
funny,
you, in that moment, internal rotation, when you have a weight overhead, that's like a hell's no. But that's not to say that internal rotation is dangerous and it should never be done.
Right. Well, and to give the audience some more perspective about that, they may be familiar with the quote-unquote Samson stretch, which is essentially like a hip flexor stretch. You're in this lunge position with your arms overhead, and your arms are overhead, your fingers are interlaced, and they're done so where your palms are facing the ceiling or facing above versus facing each other.
Right.
And I still, this is, I'm glad you brought that up. This is still something that kind of, and as I continue to evolve as a coach, something that I'm always struggling with, because yes, I think, that internal rotation, even overhead, is important. I'm always trying to come back to, especially when I only have a limited amount of time to talk to clients or to work within an hour class setting, is the layering concept that you mentioned, right? Is I want everything to connect with itself. And if I'm having them warm up with their shoulders internally rotated overhead, then how can I reasonably expect them to then understand and have already neurally mapped that ideal windup when they are going to have weights overhead, or they're going to be holding the pull-up bar, et cetera, et cetera. And, this is where, if only we had more time with our clients to really expand on that. And then I think additionally with that is this load ordering concept as well, right? That I can take the shoulder into flexion while being externally rotated and then internally rotate, right? Versus perhaps taking the shoulder into flexion, internally rotated.
Yeah, right? It feels like crap.
Yeah. So there's a sort of chain of events that we're moving within that then can be better off. And one example of that is, the forward fold, or as, what's his name? I'm blanking on Keith Wittenstein has called the panda stretch, right?
Oh yeah.
And like, there's another one where it's like, oh my God, we're stretching in a loaded position that's not neutral anymore.
No, but it feels good.
It feels good. And so, an element to that may be like, well, I'm going to have you hinge at the hips first, so that you're loading the hamstrings first with the spine in a good position.
Right.
And then from there, let's have you round the spine. And so that there's more nuances within the order of operations that validates the equation a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I also feel like we shouldn't put any categories of movements like into the like never do.
Yeah.
Because your body was designed for movement in every direction, in all directions, every day, all the time. But, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Doesn't mean you should. And also realizing that our circumstances nowadays are so different.
Yeah.
In so many ways, from like an evolutionary perspective, that so much of what we're saying a lot of times is not that it's bad, but like we said, context matters. It's bad under the context of the daily lives that we live.
Yep.
We are so rounded. So why spend more time there?
Right.
It's like you're not getting enough sleep. So to say like, well, our ancestors didn't sleep 8 hours all the time, it's like, well, that's crap, because like, that maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but were they doing all these other things on top of it? Maybe a better question is, why do we need so much sleep nowadays? Like, what is going on with the content of our lives that's requiring this sort of thing? So why has it become that internal rotation is so deemed bad as maybe a more interesting question to start thinking about, versus, it's just bad in its entirety as a blanket statement.
Right. It depends.
It depends.
That's our other blanket statement.
Right. Yeah. Which is truthful, but not really
satisfying.
It's not satisfying, nor is it helpful.
I'm pretty sure that's what we told you, Jared, in the hip immersion. Well, it depends, Jared. It depends.
That was interesting because I felt like that was taken, like people were like angry that I asked that question.
Well, no, we weren't angry. I'm trying to remember. Well, it was just so interesting because you had a totally valid point coming from your context.
Yeah.
But for people who never put weight overhead, they're like, well, why wouldn't I?
Well, my favorite is always, and that's where, because I know, as I've had different coaches, I've seen that stretch all the time, and it's frustrated me just from the standpoint of Kelly Starrett's model of like, well, I want to prep them for external rotation, and how much of our lives are being internally rotated, and I want them to feel that wind up. And, the example I always use with clients is my favorite is like, okay, I'll just hand them like any object, like here, take this marker and hold it overhead with both hands, right? Like, even if it's a marker, even if it's a like 1 ounce pen, nobody's going to hold it overhead in an internally rotated position. They'll naturally kind of bring their hands together in an external rotated position, with the fingers interlaced somewhat so their palms facing each other. However, what I then find too is even if I cue in a warm up, take your arms overhead, interlace your fingers, palms facing each other, people still go with the palms facing up, internally rotated, because that's been so habituated and because that's what they've seen mirrored over and over again. And even when I'm mirroring it in that moment and explaining it in that manner, they're still not doing it that way, because habit is so much more powerful than even my best coaching cues and example. And so then I, like, from that experience, get on my soapbox of like, everybody stop this because it's affecting my class.
Dude, you know, the soapbox, I feel like it's in every class every time you go to teach. And it's so tempting. It would be so much easier to just like hop up on the soapbox, but we have to sell it. You know, the reasoning behind why we're doing things so that people will make the right decision next time. Love the soapbox, but it also will bite you in the ass.
Yeah, and I think with that as well is this same concept of what should be able to sell it is not always that thing, and how we have to sell it sometimes it feels a little inauthentic, and you know, we struggle with that fine line of how we sell things just to get people to be compliant in the first place. You know, a good example of that is the whole paleo movement. I've heard Rob Wolf say before, like, the narrative may not be so correct in terms of this caveman anecdote. However, if that is what is then useful for people to then attach themselves to then make better decisions, who cares?
Yeah.
However, right, we always have this other end of the spectrum and that's where other people are getting upset about, is like, well, I don't want them to have the wrong understanding of history and our ancestors and, you know, like just so many of the layering points that really cannot, they can't be explained on the front end. So we have to just have to keep our wits about us so that people stick around long enough that we can have these extended conversations.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yes.
I can put it back on their court. The ball's in their court.
Yeah, man, like, you have my number, just call me.
Yeah. Or how does it feel for you? Imagine having pain-free shoulders like this every day. Here's my card. Give me a call.
Just imagine.
Fantasize.
Signed,
sealed, and
that experience. And let's go from there. All right. Well, I think we're going to end this here. I'm going to end it with a little journal reading of mine. And then, Alex, if you'd like to have any closing sharing statements, please take hold of the soapbox.
I love me my soapbox.
So one of my goals and hopes for the podcast was to allow myself to work on being more vulnerable. And I stumbled upon this journaling that was probably a year ago as I was shifting up some notebooks recently looking for, of course, something else. And I felt like it was really applicable to this topic as well as to the impetus and catalyst for this podcast as a whole. So this was my journal entry. End of the day thoughts. Too tired to sit up and write with good posture. I am frustrated. I am hard on myself. What should I leave out of the fundamental classes with clients? Where does the rabbit hole begin? Troubleshooting involves joint capsule, musculature, soft tissue work, but is that too much to expound on in the first lesson? Yet, aren't I trying to advance the conversation? To what end? How do I make it feel less rushed? Should I play the classes by ear less? I need a change, ? I need a change, period. To be the best coach in a class versus to be the best coach in a small group versus to be the best coach one-on-one. What is the common denominator? What are the common denominators? Language and communication. I have to help myself get out of my own head to not be in the negative feedback loop in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's super awesome to share those ideas. And I think that's all of those ideas are what you and I are hoping to create, a community with this podcast of people who are willing to say, I don't know.
Let's all just, let's definitely bond over that. And I think we can more successfully take down some of the egos and have much more honest, critical conversations to get to better answers that don't leave us all feeling so much in that defensive place.
Totally, because if we're all, walking around puffing our tail feathers, pretending like we know it all, you're not going to be able to reap the benefits of what your peers know from their own experiences and their own learnings. 100%.
Definitely.
So where, Jared, can people find you on the interwebs?
People can find me at cpbgrowth.com as well as ITSDERAJ. It's Daraj on Instagram and Twitter, and then just my name, Jared Cohen, on Facebook.
Awesome. And you can find me at aewellness.com, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Holla for some Mala. And show notes and other episodes and all kinds of fun stuff for this show live at behindthepodiumpodcast.com.
Living on the Ethernets.
Woot woot.
Until next time. Hey guys, thanks for listening to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. If you have enjoyed what you listened to, head over to iTunes and leave us a review. More information on each episode and the podcast in general can be found at behindthepodiumpodcast.com. We'll catch you next time.